Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to get started. My name is Pete Huff. I'm the Program Officer for the Pasture Project, who is hosting this webinar tonight. The webinar is Adaptive Grazing 101, Part 2, the Principles of Adaptive Grazing, of Compounding, Diversifying, and Disrupting with Dr. Alan Williams. This webinar is the second of a three-part series. So wanted to welcome you to this beginner series that is focused on adaptive grazing and establishing the fundamentals. So really quickly about the Pasture Project, just a quick plug here for who we are. The Pasture Project is an initiative of the Wallace Center, and we work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable and importantly market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in the upper Mississippi River Basin, a 6-state region, although we do work with national audiences as well, as much as we can. And we pursue really 4 key strategies to help promote regenerative grazing or adaptive grazing. The first is collecting data and looking for the field-tested case studies and practices that really build the case for regenerative grazing, both the economic and the environmental benefits of adaptive grazing systems. We also pull together resources that are necessary for planning these kind of operations, as well as transitioning management practices. So this includes tools, decision support resources, and just general information, as well as opportunities to connect with like-minded peer-to-peer for learning. We work with a lot of different supporters across the upper Midwest who are in support of adaptive grazing, and we try to build that groundswell of practice to engage more folks in more places. And finally, we work with political, financial, and other systems to try to open up more channels that might otherwise stop someone who's interested from getting involved in pasture-raised livestock in the upper Midwest. We want to make sure that we free up as many channels and avenues for folks to be as successful as possible. There's a lot more to us. You can find that on our website, pastureproject.org. And you can also send an email. We're more than happy to have conversations with folks that are interested in working in this space. I want to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Alan Williams is one of the nation and world's most renowned experts on adaptive grazing and land management practices. He's a 6th-generation family farmer with a wealth of knowledge and experience, currently based in Mississippi. Although I think he's joining us from Tennessee, so he sees a lot of this country. He's got quite an academic background, having spent quite a bit of time in the academic field with his bachelor and master's in animal science from Clemson, as well as a PhD in livestock genetics from LSU. So he has quite a bit of the background knowledge and theoretical knowledge that goes along with this, but he also has a lot of the practical experience. And you can see a photo here from one of our field days in Illinois. Alan is a person to get out in the field and work one-on-one with farmers from large to small throughout the United States, North America, and South America. He's a founding partner for Grass-Fed Insights, LLC, as well as Soil Health Consultants and the Soil Health Academy, doing quite a bit of outreach and education throughout the country. He's a partner at Joyce Farms, and he's also on the board of director of the Grass-Fed Exchange, which you can look forward to coming up later in June, and the Mississippi Sustainable Agriculture Network. He's a core team member for the Pasture Project, and he's also a co-investigator with Team Soil Carbon. Alan is a published author. You can read his writing in a lot of periodicals that deal with grazing and beyond. He's a consultant working, as I mentioned, with a lot of different farms, helping them work through their goals in implementing adaptive systems and building soil health, and he's also a featured speaker. So with that, I will pass it over to Alan, who will walk us through his presentation in this second part of Adaptive Grazing 101. So Alan, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Pete. Appreciate that, and good evening, everyone. Good to have you here this evening on our second part of our Adaptive Grazing webinar series. So for those of you that attended the first series last week, that was basically an introduction, and now we are headed into sort of the nuts and bolts of adaptive grazing. This evening, I'm going to be talking about the 3 principles of adaptive grazing and how they practically apply to what you're doing. I'll also be presenting some further data that would help substantiate and validate why we want to graze this way. So we're going to dive right into this. And basically, there are three principles that we have, I guess, discovered, might be the proper word, from our work in regenerative grazing over the last 20 years. And what we have found is, through work all across North America, South America, and in other countries, we have found that these three principles apply no matter where you are globally. If we follow these principles, then we can have really good success with regenerating our pastures and our soil through our grazing applications. So the first principle is the principle of compounding, the second, the principle of diversity, and the third, the principle of disruption. So first of all, we'll discuss the principle of compounding. What we now know is that in nature and with biology, there are never any singular effects or impacts. Everything is always compounding and cascading. And secondly, these compounding and cascading effects are never neutral. They're always either positive or negative. And what we have found is that the way that we manage our farms and ranches has an awful lot to do with whether we are helping to create positive or negative compounding and cascading effects. So in essence, everything that we do creates this whole series of compounding events, whether we realize it or not, and whether we intend for that to happen or not. It's still going to happen. And that's the first thing we have to understand. If we understand that, then we can start asking ourselves that question every time we make a management decision relative to our grazing practices. Is what I'm getting ready to do going to create some kind of positive compounding effect or negative compounding effect? Now, the other thing we have to understand is that there are epigenetic effects out there as well that are tied into this. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with epigenetics, but epigenetics is simply defined as the influence of the environment or environmental factors on gene expression in an individual. So everything that has DNA, every single organism that has DNA, and that ranges from microbes to earthworms to dung beetles to pollinators to our plants to our livestock and of course to us, all of those are impacted by epigenetic effects. And as you all are aware, genes occur in pairs, and the degree to which those pairs of genes can influence any particular trait or traits can vary. That is called degree of expression of gene pairs. So gene pairs can express themselves anywhere from very little to fully and anywhere in between. And so environmental factors can play a very large role in how pairs of genes express themselves. There's actually quite a bit of research and peer-reviewed articles out there now on epigenetic effects that you can look up and study. But for tonight, this is not a seminar on epigenetics, but I just simply want you to know that what we do in our management practices with our grazing practices or any other farming practice, by the way, can produce either positive or negative epigenetic effects. And these epigenetic effects can actually be transgenerational. The second principle is the principle of diversity. So bottom line is that we want highly diverse and complex pastures and annual mixtures, not monocultures. Monocultures create near monocultures in many other ways and actually contribute to a series of negative compounding and cascading effects. Monocultures, frankly, do not help us with creating positive compounding effects. because nature doesn't work that way and biology does not work that way. Monocultures are strictly man-made, and we have to understand that. And when we impose our will like that through monocultures, then we're actually interfering with nature and interfering with ecosystems. So now we understand we have to have a place for monocultures and row crop production, but we know that in between we need to have very highly complex cover crop mixes to help make up for the losses that are incurred through that monoculture. So what do I mean by highly diverse and complex pastures and annual mixes? Well, first of all, I want both perennials and annuals to contain all three of the major plant classes: grasses, legumes, and forbs. This is very important because there are contributions both from a microbial array standpoint, a root exudate standpoint, and secondary and tertiary metabolite production standpoint for all three of these major plant classes. We all are familiar with the primary nutrients that are produced by plants. When we have a forage analysis done, that's what we get back. We get back the primary nutrients. But few are aware of the fact that all plants also produce secondary and tertiary compounds, nutritive or chemical compounds. And these compounds play a major role in creating a series of positive compounding effects and benefits for our livestock, for our soils, and our soil microbial population. Now, why do we want complexity and diversity? Again, first of all, it creates very positive compounding and cascading effects. As we said, they're always occurring, whether they're positive or negative, so diversity contributes to positive compounding effects. We mentioned the secondary and tertiary compounds produced by plants. Well, the work of Dr. Fred Provenza, Professor Emeritus at Utah State University, and a number of others has shown us the importance of these secondary and tertiary compounds. And one of the major important factors of these compounds is that they actually produce medicinal benefits for the livestock that eat them, and for us, by the way. If you'll recall, the vast majority of the pharmaceuticals that human beings take today were originally derived from a plant substance. So we get most of our pharmaceuticals originally from isolating specific secondary and tertiary compounds in plants. Therefore, animals, livestock, wildlife, and birds and others that eat these plants and seeds from these plants can also benefit from these secondary and tertiary compounds. Secondly, these secondary and tertiary compounds, through the mycorrhizal fungi interconnecting roots of plants underneath the soil surface, actually can be transferred from one type of plant to another. And a benefit within plants that these secondary and tertiary compounds confer is that they help protect plants from disease and pest. So the more diversity we have, the greater resistance we have of the plants in that mix to be able to resist diseases and pests that may attack those fields. We also benefit from the fact that the greater the diversity and complexity of plants, the greater the diversity of microbial species that's going to exist in the soil beneath those plants, around their roots in the rhizosphere. We also see a greater diversity in macroorganisms. For instance, all the different types of beetles and other insects that help to degrade and shred dead plant materials on the soil surface. We also see a greater array of pollinator insects. And all of this combines to produce exponential rather than linear effects. So we have a rule of three within our principle of diversity. And again, that rule of three is that in perennial and annual mixes, we want to see grasses, legumes, and forbs all represented. Now, most people are going to view forbs as weeds, but yet those very weeds are often the originators of the most powerful secondary and tertiary chemical compounds. So they can produce some profoundly positive effects in that mix. So I actually like to see these forbs in every one of our mixes. So this is what we want our pastures to look like. In our perennial pastures, we want mixes of grasses, legumes, and forbs. In our warm season annuals, we can design them to have mixes of all three of those major plant classes, and likewise in our cool season annuals. I do a lot of work not only with beef grazers, but also with dairy grazers around the country. And this is an example of some of the perennial mixes that we have encouraged in many of our dairy pastures. So you can see that we have certainly followed the principle of diversity here and the rule of three. We have multiple types of grasses, legumes, and forbs all represented. And again, if you look down at that list, some of the legumes and some of those forbs down there, many of you might say, well, those are weeds, Alan. Well, it's all in your definition. I can tell you this, livestock will eat every one of these, and every one of these has a profoundly positive effect on the performance of those livestock. The final principle is the principle of disruption. And the thing that I want to point out here is that nature has tremendous resilience and responds well to challenges. But these challenges need to be planned, purposeful disruptions. And when we do this, we create a host of very positive compounding effects. Now, I often give the analogy to help people understand the principle of disruption and the resilience of nature and the ability to respond to challenges. I compare nature to an athlete. A human athlete, to perform well and at a very high level, has to consistently change their exercise routine, both the routine itself, the exercises that they do, and the intensity at which they do them if they're going to progress. Nobody ever ran a marathon by only running 1 mile a day. They may have started off running 1 mile a day, but then they worked themselves up to 5, 10, 15, 20, and so forth until they could finally run a full marathon. Likewise, a weightlifter never broke a record in any weightlifting event by lifting that record on day one. They had to first start off lifting much lighter weight, build their body up, and continually challenge their body by adding weight and intensity at which they were lifting weights before they had the ability to be able to break a record. Nature, like our bodies, is comprised of biology. So if our bodies are biology and they respond to challenges very positively, nature does as well. So never discount the tremendous resilience of nature and the fact that if we don't introduce planned, purposeful disruptions, nature's going to trend towards an equilibrium, because just like our bodies say, well, I'm not being challenged anymore. I've done these same exercises at this intensity over and over. I don't have to get stronger. I don't have to get bigger. I don't have to build more endurance. Nature's going to say the same. And that's often why we make an initial change in our farming or ranching practices and notice a difference. But then after a while, we seem to hit a wall or a ceiling and wonder why our progress stopped. Well, it stopped because you're doing the same thing at the same intensity over and over. You can't expect to continue to make progress. As a matter of fact, what you can expect is to hit that wall and then to start digressing. Things will actually start going backwards. So what are some of these planned purposeful disruptions then? Well, first of all, don't do things the same way every time. Okay, it's that simple. Now, that's our human tendency. We want to settle into a routine, and that just doesn't work well in terms of being able to create disruption and to continue to make progress. We got to remember that adaptive management is not a routine. So how can we be disruptive? If we're growing row crops, we can rotate crop species and cultivars from moderate to high diversity. We can introduce livestock row crop rotations. We can reduce our tillage down to minimum till and then to no-till. We can rotate our cover crop mixes from moderate to high diversity in those mixes. And you absolutely want to rotate mixes. You don't want to plant the same cover crop mix year in and year out. That would be a mistake. We can introduce other practices like roll down and plant green into roll down. So there's a number of different practices that we can employ in row cropping operations to purposefully introduce plant disruptions. Now, what about our grazing? Last week, we spent a lot of time talking about stock densities versus stocking rate. And we talked about how to calculate effective stock densities and the different types of stock densities we can utilize. Well, one of the ways that we can introduce plant disruptions in our grazing is to alter stock densities. Do not graze each acre at the same stock density year in and year out. Change the stock density year after year on any given pasture or paddock and do it at magnitude. For instance, if last year you averaged 40,000 pounds per acre on grazing a specific paddock, the next year you need to have a magnitude difference. Going from 40 to 50,000 pounds is essentially the same. That does not introduce a disruption. You need to go from 40,000 pounds to 150,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 pounds. That's a magnitude difference, and that's what you want to do. Secondly, and a lot of grazers do this, every year, year in and year out, they move their livestock through the same rotations around their farm in the exact same pattern every year. They start out in the same first pasture every spring and move to pasture A, B, C, D, E, and F. Instead of doing that, if you started A, B, C, D, E, and F this year, start at D next year and move through the rotation. It really does make a significant difference. It may seem like, well, what in the world kind of difference does that make? But it makes an enormous difference. If you move through the same rotations, particularly at the same time of year, same time of the season every year, you're inadvertently causing a plant succession that you didn't realize you were causing. Another thing that we can do is alter grazing heights on and off. Then we can alter rest periods. I do a lot of what I call skip a paddock. And every year I'll just sort of randomly do this. I'll just randomly pick a paddock and say, okay, I'm going to skip over that paddock and give it a double or triple rest period this year and go beyond it before I come back to it on the next round of my rotations. That can make a profound difference. And alter which paddocks you give a double rest each year as well. Don't do the same one every year, obviously. If you're a multi-species grazer, alter the species order. Don't always move the different livestock species through your fields at the same rate or the same species going 1, 2, 3, 4. Alter them. So if you graze your cattle first, followed by small ruminants, followed by poultry, alter it the next time. Maybe run poultry through there first, then small ruminants, then cattle. It does make a difference. Alter species order occasionally. So, and then the final one, alter the time of season or year that you are grazing a particular paddock if you tend to be in it at the exact or close to the same time every year. So those are, and there's many other ways we can be disruptive, but those are some of the major ones that are easy to do and easy to implement. Now, in saying that, you've got to have good records. And last week I mentioned that there are 2 apps that I can recommend that work very well. One is the Pasture Map app, and the other is Maya Grazing. You can Google those. Pasture Map is spelled just like it sounds. You can go to pasturemap.com, and Maya Grazing is M-A-I-A. So you can Google Maya Grazing and find out about both of those apps and which one may suit you. So let's look at some of the benefits of grazing according to the principle of compounding, the principle of diversity, and the principle of disruption. First of all, if we follow good grazing practices, we're going to leave plenty of residue. That's going to create a lot of positive compounding effects and encourage more diversity in our mix, and it's going to protect our soil temperatures. The picture here, you see the temps were taken at the same time on the same day. Where we have our soil protected and shaded, the temperature was 87 degrees. Where it was unprotected, it was 20 degrees higher, 107 degrees. We have actually seen differences between shaded soil, where we have a nice thick stand density, and unprotected soil of more than 60 degrees. Now the prior picture was taken by soil thermometers. As you saw, these temperatures in this slide were taken by a FLIR camera, or forward-looking infrared camera, that allow us to be able to measure using the infrared camera soil temperatures. This happened to be a pasture that was being stock grazed, so they were grazing it down tight in certain areas and leaving tufts of grass in others. The air temperature, or ambient temperature, that particular day that we were out in this pasture was 96 degrees. And you can see where we have the yellows and the oranges and the reds, that's where the soil temperature is very hot. You can see in that spot it was 133 degrees. But yet just a few feet away, where the cattle had left the tuft of grass, the soil temperature was only 87 degrees. That's a pretty profound difference when the air temperature is 96. So here's why this is so important. At 70 degrees soil temperature, 100% of our soil moisture is available for plant growth and regrowth and microbial support. When soils reach 100 degrees, and this is too easy for that to happen, every one of you, no matter where you live, in the summertime particularly, we've measured this all over Canada, the upper Midwest, everywhere, and in the summertime, soil temperatures can easily go well above 100 degrees if the soil's not protected. So it doesn't matter where you're located. At 100 degree soil temperature, 85% of our soil moisture is lost, and only 15% is now available for plant growth and regrowth and microbial support. At 115 degrees, the microbes begin to break down, and at 140 degrees, they die. So it's very important to protect that, both to protect our soil moisture and our microbes. The other thing is that if we protect that soil temperature and moisture, our livestock perform far better in hot summer days. They require far less shade and far less water. That is really critically important for livestock performance when it gets hot and humid. So what we need to remember here is that last week we talked about not allowing our cattle to take more than 50% total of the available forage biomass. Well, if we do that and keep the soil shaded and protected, then our cattle, the soil temperature never heats up above 80-something degrees. And our cattle are far, far more comfortable. And this goes for cattle, sheep, goats, whatever you have on your pastures. And again, they're able to withstand the heat of the day and not require near as much water. And the fact of the matter is, we are the same way. I've actually done this on various farms and ranches where I have people stand on bare soil or on the dirt road where the soil's heated up, and then go stand several feet away where we have dense, thick forage, and the soil temperature is 30 to 50 degrees cooler. They feel much more comfortable as well. So it not only impacts our livestock, we can actually feel the difference as well. Another benefit that we get is much more even manure distribution. When we have set stock grazing or slow rotations, then most of our manure and urine is going to be concentrated in areas near water and shade. I showed a real life picture of this in last week's seminar on a farm that the guy didn't understand what was going on till we pointed it out to him. But when we go to much more frequent rotations through adaptive grazing, then we get much more even manure and urine distribution throughout the entire pasture. And this is what it means. With continuous or sex stock grazing, it takes 27 years to get 1 pile of manure for every square yard of pasture. 27 years. That's almost a lifetime of grazing for that to occur. But if we ratchet down to just 1 move a day, it only takes 1 year versus 27 to achieve that same goal. And this is why it's important. If we look at the value of manure as a fertilizer, in turn, everybody wants to talk NP and K. If you have a standard soil test done, then what is your report? It's the recommendations are apply so much NP and K. Well, how much fertilizer, how much NP and K does a cow apply each day through her manure? Well, she applies 0.23 N, 0.15 P, and 0.52 K. So our example here, if we have 100 cows weighing an average of 1,000 pounds each, and they graze 1 acre for 1 day, through their manure alone, they're going to apply in that single day 23 units of N, 15 of P, and 52 of K. 3 grazing days annually per acre with those same cattle will deposit over that year 69 N, 45 P, 156 K. This is another benefit that we see from the use of adaptive or regenerative grazing. We see greatly enhanced soil aggregation, which obviously produces a host of positive compounding and cascading effects, not the least of which is greatly enhanced water infiltration and oxygen infiltration into the soil, coupled with the fact that our microbes are now able, because we've got greater water and oxygen infiltration, our microbes are able to move and transport themselves better on these films of water that are in the soil. They reproduce much more rapidly. They're able to better positively impact the mineral cycle, pick up minerals and feed them to the plants. The plants produce more exudates to feed the microbes. We don't have the ponding and pooling of water, so therefore we greatly reduce and even eliminate sediment loss or erosion. We greatly reduce or eliminate nitrate and phosphate leaching. So it's a whole, and we could go on, but it's a whole host of positive compounding effects that really benefit us here. So we talked about diversity and how diversity in our pastures is very, very important. Well, let me give you a couple of research studies that further illustrate the importance of this. First of all, we have found that plant species richness promotes soil carbon and nitrogen stocks and grasslands even without legumes. So we can have nitrogen fixation with free-living nitrogen fixers in the soil in the absence of legumes. And when we have a greater plant species diversity or richness, this creates greater carbon and nitrogen stores. So what they found in this research is when 8 species mixes were compared to monoculture of the same species, soil carbon and nitrogen stocks increased by 16 to 18%. And that's pretty impactful, very significant. And that's the type of impact we want to try to have on our soil nutrients. A second study published in 2017 showed that root biomass and exudates were linked to plant diversity and significantly and positively impacted soil, bacterial, and fungal biomass. So the bottom line is that in this particular study, they found that plant diversity increases the composition and functioning of soil biota. It increased the biomass of the bacteria and fungi in the soil, improved the fungal to bacterial ratio, and produced greater root exudates. And then finally, it increased not only shoot biomass, or the portion of the plant growing above the ground, but it also increased the root biomass. It increased the amount of root exudates being produced. And as we said earlier, that in turn increased the bacterial biomass and the fungal biomass. So once again, diversity absolutely matters and produces profoundly positive compounding and cascading effects. So if we look at a monoculture, we not only have a monoculture above the ground, but we have a monoculture of roots beneath the soil surface. And they are, of course, just like what's growing above the ground, is pretty even in its height and density. So are the roots beneath the ground. However, when we have a multitude of plant species growing in our pastures, we not only have the diversity and complexity of plant height and biomass and so forth that we can visually see above the ground, but we have tremendous diversity and complexity of root mass and root depth and even type of root beneath the soil surface. And where do the majority of soil microbes live and function? Well, they live in that root zone, the rhizosphere. This is their home. So the more living space we create by putting more roots and root mass in the ground, then the more home the microbes have, so we can have a lot more microbes working for us. So we see here in the rhizosphere, if we have microbes working for us, they're going to help shunt water, nutrients, minerals, all of that to the plant. The plant in return is going to feed those microbes by its own production of root exudates or root sugars. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide, we see a pine seedling. And the roots of that pine seedling are actually what you see here, if you can see my arrows. So the roots are actually fairly small and do not cover a lot of territory or reach in the soil. Now, these finer white filaments that you see are not root hairs, that's mycorrhizal fungi. And so you can see that the mycorrhizal fungi, in association with the plant roots, greatly extends both the vertical and horizontal reach of those plant roots. So the water and minerals that that plant could not reach with its own roots, it can now obtain through the function of the mycorrhizal fungi. And then if we look at, on the right-hand part of the slide, we see an up-close view of a root tip. You see all of the microbial associations that we should have there right around that rhizosphere, around that root. So the microbes flourish in the area around plant roots and take up organic acids from the root exudates, and then in turn they capture minerals to feed back to the plants. What you're seeing here is fungi in the soil surrounding a pine tree root. And then these are spores of a soil fungus as it is replicating. And then these are photosynthetic bacteria in the soil. So these are just examples of the different types of microbes that we should encounter. And we need to also remember that a large percentage of our organic matter increase in carbon will come from the roots of these plants as they die off and regrow and die off and regrow. Now, why is the amount of plant that we allow our cattle or any other livestock to remove through their grazing so critically important? This slide pretty much says it all. If we allow our cattle or sheep or goats or whatever to remove up to 50% of the total leaf volume of our plants in our pasture, we only have 2 to 4% root growth stoppage. But look what happens when we go just another 10%. Now, to our eyes, we think that's very little difference at all. And we would say visually, well, how could going from 50 to 60% have any kind of substantial impact different from one to the other? But it does. It does. And this is profound. If there's one thing I want you to take home from this evening, I want you to take this home. When you go from 50% to 60% removal, you jump from 2 to 4% root growth stoppage all the way up to 50%. Now that makes an enormous difference, and that can make a season-long difference in your grazing. Now look what happens when we allow them to move up to 70%. Now we're up to almost 80% root growth stoppage, and when we go above 70%, now we're into 100% root growth stoppage for a while. If you happen to turn off hot and dry when you do that, you have just negatively, according to the principle of compounding again, you have created a whole series of negative compounding effects that are going to seriously and significantly alter your grazing potential for the rest of that grazing season and potentially into next year's grazing season as well. So if we look at this slide, again, we see what some of these compounding effects are. So if we look there at example A, if we allow our livestock to crop these pastures down tight, then you can see that not only have we removed the shading and the protection to protect our soil moisture and soil temperature, but we have also created a very significant root die-off. And when those roots die off, the living portion of the root is now where? It's much closer to the surface of the soil. So living roots are no longer able to reach down deeper for soil moisture. And what are our compounding effects? Well, there's a whole host of them. And in this case, they will be negative. So number one, we've lost the protection to our soil moisture and soil temperature. We're going to lose a lot of our moisture through evaporative loss, and our soil temperature is going to heat up greatly. We've talked about the negative impacts of that. It starts to kill the microbes, so we lose microbes. We lose a lot of roots. So where do the microbes live? In the roots, and they feed off the root exudates. So if that's the case, again, we've killed a lot of our microbes, and we've killed them in more ways than one, through the higher temperatures of the soil and through destroying their living space. When we destroy a lot of microbes, we're going to lose a lot of our soil glues or our biotic glues. And therefore, we're going to lose that quickly some of our soil aggregate. That means that water infiltration rates that quickly will be far less. So when you finally do get a rain in the hot, dry summer, then not nearly as much of that rainfall will infiltrate. And that's the critical point in time that we really needed infiltrating. So if you allow to happen what we see here in example A, then what will happen is we'll get, again, these host of negative compounding effects. If it turns off hot and dry when you do this, again, as I said earlier, you have just negatively impacted the entire rest of your grazing season. And you'll find yourself feeding hay and other supplements far earlier that summer, that fall, or that winter. However, in B, you can see that if we only allow them to take up to 50% of the available forage dry matter, then we still get our shading and protecting. We have far less root die-off, and we have a whole host of positive compounding. We've protected our soil temperature, our soil moisture. We've kept our livestock more comfortable. Our forages, our grasses, legumes, and forbs can regenerate, regrow much more rapidly. Our microbial population is protected. Our diversity is protected. So we've protected a whole bunch of things when we follow example B. Now I want to dive in real quick to Brix. And with Brix, I don't know how many of you measure this, but we have found that this produces some very significant positive compounding effects for us. And Brix is simply a measure of the dissolved plant solids in the juice or sap of a plant, or in a fruit like a watermelon or a tomato or a cucumber or a grape. In the fruit and vegetable industry, they've used Brix for quite a while to be able to determine quality and when to harvest and those types of things, particularly in vineyards, in order to make different types of wines. We have just more recently started using Brix in row crop production and forage production, and have found that this is a quick and simple way to allow us as grazers to be able to keep close tabs on nutrient density in our forages. So what's in the plant solids that we're measuring with Brix? Well, a lot of people think, well, it's just sugars. Yes, but it's not just sugars. We're also measuring minerals, amino acids, proteins, lipids, and pectins. Everything that refracts the sunlight in the refractometer is part of the dissolved plant solids. So it's not just measuring sugars, it's measuring total nutrient density in those plants. You can use a simple instrument, again, called a refractometer. For field applications, we use the optical version that you see pictured here. The digital is more for lab use. The optical is much more suited to field use out in the pastures. You can buy a good optical for anywhere from about $80 to $150. The model you see here is an Otago. That's what I favor, but there's many other good makes and models out there. But I would caution you, don't buy the cheapest model. They will not last. They're not durable. They won't stay calibrated properly. Buy a good model. So how do we measure Brix? Well, we just pluck leaf and blade material from the individual plants that we want to measure. I take that material, I ball it up in the palms of my hand and rub it vigorously between my two palms until I feel moisture on my palms. And that way I know that I've started breaking up the cellular walls to release the juices. You want to do this on sunny days only and in the afternoon. Why? Because Brix is highest on sunny days and it's highest every 24-hour photo period in the afternoon. So be consistent in your measurements. So you're always comparing apples to apples to apples. We've done lots of Brix measurements and looking at different times a day and so forth. And in the mornings, particularly the early mornings, Brix can be significantly lower than it will be in the afternoons. On a lot of plant species, Brix can be double or more in the afternoons versus what it was in the morning. So if I measured a 6% Brix on a particular grass in the morning, that same grass may measure a 12 to 14% Brix on that same day in the afternoon. Now just keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to talk in a moment about why that's so important. So we squeeze the juices from those plants onto the stage of the refractometer, hold it up to the sunlight, and there's an internal scale in there that goes from 0 to 30%, and the higher the better. The higher the percent, the greater the nutrient density. And it allows us to be able to instantly see what we've got in those forages on that day. Now, why do we want forages that are higher Brix? Well, there's quite a bit of peer-reviewed research that shows that high Brix forages increases animal gains. And in dairy, it increases fluid milk production and the milk components, milk fat and milk protein. High Brix forages are also it makes the plants themselves, if they're high Brix versus low Brix, they're more drought resistant, freeze tolerant, and more resistant to plant diseases and pests. Now, why is this important to us on an everyday basis? Well, here's why. We've done many, many years of research now in Brix and compiled quite a bit of data. So we've been able to run regression analysis, correlation coefficients, and so forth. And what we have found is that for pastures that have a Brix of 5% or less, average daily gains typically tend to be either less than 1 or in the low ones. And without additional supplementation, the cattle can't do any better than that. They just simply can't do any better. You're going to have additional supplementation for them to do better than that. If the Brix is averaging 8 to 12%, we can now get average daily gains up to about the low 2s or so. If we're averaging higher than 15%, now we can get average daily gains in the high 2s to even the 3s. And what we have discovered is by measuring Brix all over North America, we've measured from Nova Scotia to British Columbia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific in the US and down in Mexico. And what we have found is that no matter where we go, the average Brix in most pastures is between 3 and 5%. That's not very good, but it's between 3 and 5%. And so we've used 3% as our base Brix for our regression analysis. And what we found is that for every 1% increase in Brix over that 3%, we add at least another 1/10 of a pound average daily gain. So think about it. If we can improve our pastures from a 3% Brix to a 13% Brix, we hit on the same pasture, same forages. We don't have to change plant species. Just improve our microbial population. That's what creates better Brix. Greater microbial activity will result in greater Brix in the plants because they're being fed more minerals by the microbes. It is that simple. So what if we increase from 3% to 13%, we have added another 1 pound a day average daily gain on the same pastures, same forages. In dairy, we have found that if we go from just 3% to 6% Brix, we increase fluid milk production between 10 and 20%, and we increase milk components by about 15%, just jumping from 3 to 6. And that's a very easy thing to do. So if we look at this chart here, this graph, we see that as we increase Brix, then we increase average daily gain pretty linearly up until we get into the low 20s. And that's when we start to threshold a little bit. So we can achieve average daily gains that are feedlot quality if we have high Brix pastures. And this is how within our branded program, we do, as many of you know, we have a branded grass-fed beef program. And within that program, this is how we achieve very, very high levels of percent choice and prime on our cattle week in and week out. The last 6 weeks in a row, we just got our data in from this week's kill and fab. The cattle were fabbed on Monday. And what we found the last 6 weeks in a row, coming off high Brix pastures, percent choice and prime out of load lots of cattle, we've averaged 95, 98, 97, 98, 98, and this week 100% choice and prime out of load lots of cattle. You cannot do that. You can't hit those very high rates of choice and prime on grass-fed cattle without having high Brix forages. So that's the advantage. This particular trial that you see here, what we did was we did split side-by-side comparisons. So you can see this is different parts of the country, the U.S., 6 different states that we did these trials in with these cooperating farms. And what we did was we randomly split their cow herds, and these guys were all conventional grazers when we started this. So they were just getting started into adaptive grazing. So what we did was we split the cow herds. Half of the cow herd remained under conventional grazing, set stock grazing, and the other half were adaptively grazed. So within a single season, you can see the plant Brix impact. We significantly increased plant Brix in each one of these simply through changing the way that we grazed, and we did it in the same season. So this, again, why? Because we improved the soil microbial biomass and activity. So if we're talking about plant Brix relative to what you need those cattle to try to consume on a dry matter basis in your forages every day to halfway perform, you can see that as plant Brix improves, the cattle actually have to eat less. They have to take fewer bites of dry matter every day to have the same level of performance. And with low plant Brix, it's almost they almost cannot eat enough. It's like eating low quality hay. They almost can't eat enough to fully support themselves and to perform like we want them to perform. Now, another thing that I want to point out here before we end for this evening and go to questions is the effects of the stage of maturity on pasture composition. Many people, and again, this is a visual thing for us as grazers, we want to graze our pastures when they're highly vegetative, early maturity. But yet, look at the ratio between proteins and carbohydrates in our sugars when we're early maturity. Protein is way too high. Our sugars are way too low. Our cattle are not going to perform well. Neither are other livestock. They're going to be squirting out the rear end. And when they're squirting out the rear end, they're not performing very well. This is our sweet spot. Right around that mid-stage maturity is when we have a far better balance between proteins and carbohydrates in our forages. And this is where we graze to get those high percentages of choice and prime on our grass fats. That's what does it, not grazing at early maturity. The other thing, if you're grass finishing, if you're grazing early maturity forages because of the high protein, not only are they squirting, but you're running the risk of producing significant off flavors throughout that entire carcass, a flavor that your customers won't like very well. This was in Canada last summer. We were doing a workshop up here at one of our clients in Manitoba. And this forage, as you see it standing there that day, was 23% Brix. Now we had 100 and something ranchers out there that day, and every one of them thought this forage was way too mature and that this rancher had let it get out of hand and that it wasn't worth anything, that he had wasted his grass. That's exactly what the majority of the ranchers thought. So we pulled out the refractometer, started measuring Brix, and it averaged 23% Brix on exactly what you see in these slides. The cattle were performing exceptionally well and gaining exceptionally well on those that he was grass fattening on what you see in this picture. So I call these things too big to ignore. There's two keys to better gains. One is the stage of maturity of your forage when you graze, and we just talked about that. We want to target mid-stage as much as we possibly can. And the other is the timing of our daily moves. Now, remember I told you back when we were talking about how to measure Brix to keep in mind that Brix is at its highest every day in the afternoon. And it can be significantly lower in the mornings. Well, when do you want to move your cattle then to take advantage of that? Move them in the afternoons, not in the mornings. Not in the mornings. If you move them in the morning, and that's the only time of the day that you move them, and a lot of people do because they, well, I'm headed to work, or I want to get that done and out of the way so I can tend to other chores throughout the day and not have to worry about moving my cattle anymore. That mistake just cost you as much as a ½ pound a day average daily gain. It's a loss that you incurred, not because the cattle wouldn't gain that, but because you moved them at the wrong time of the day. Simply waiting till later in the day to move them, midday to mid-afternoon, you can add as much as another ½ pound a day average daily gain. That's free gain that you're giving up by making those moves in the morning. And I know what many of you are thinking, well, Alan, in the summertime, if I move them in the afternoon, they're not going to graze, they're going to be shaded up, it's too hot, they're not going to perform. We move our cattle 3 to 4 times a day in Mississippi and Alabama in the afternoons. And we get these levels of performance that I just described to you. Why? Even in our heat and humidity, can we do that? And why do the cattle actually graze during the heat of the day like that? Because we have protected our soil moisture and soil temperature. They're not nearly as negatively impacted. If you're grazing down tight and you don't have your soil protected, you're going to have a tough time with your cattle performing in the afternoon and taking advantage of higher Brix. So I'll close with this. Important grazing tips. You need to know your dry matter, and we talked last Thursday in that particular webinar about how to calculate dry matter availability. And if you missed that, again, that webinar is recorded on the pastureproject.org website. You can go back and access that. But know your dry matter availability, and then calculate to allow your cattle to consume 3 to 3.5% of their body weight in dry matter per head each 24-hour period. Don't allow them to take more than 30 to 50% available dry matter in a single grazing. Move them forward rapidly enough that you don't allow them to take too many bites and bite too deep on the same plant. Again, that'll create a host of negative compounding effects that we don't want to create, not the least of which is yo-yoing cattle performance, their gain performance. It'll go up and down, up and down. Know the Brix content. Again, it's as simple as purchasing a refractometer and measuring and charting Brix on a routine basis. If you get one of these, the Pasture Map or Maya Grazing apps, you can enter Brix into that app to record it and to have it archived there. Turn your livestock into new paddocks in the early to mid-afternoon rather than in the early morning. Again, you'll get far better performance. And finally, the stage of your forage maturity is critical if you want to have higher levels of performance. Target grazing most of your paddocks and your grazing rotations so that you're getting to most of these paddocks when they're at about mid-stage maturity or slightly beyond, not very early maturity or highly vegetative. So those are the grazing tips that I wanted to point out. So we'll wrap up this series. That's about all the time we have tonight, and to still do questions. But we'll wrap this thing up Thursday evening by finishing up talking about some very practical aspects of how to implement these 3 principles. And to do that, we'll use some case studies where we talked about how actual farms and ranches used the 3 principles: the principle of compounding, the principle of diversity, and the principle of disruption, to create significant improvements in not only livestock and soil health performance, but also in economic, financial performance of their farms and ranches. So we'll be presenting those case studies and talking very practically about what they did, how they implemented to achieve that. And then I'll also show you ideas on water, rigging out UTVs and ATVs for doing your portable or temporary fencing, and those types of things. So we'll go into some very practical aspects for fencing and water as well. So with that, I'm going to end for this evening and open it up for questions, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Alan. I appreciate that. We will make the transition. We have about 13 minutes here before we wrap up for the evening on this particular webinar. So if you haven't already, again, you can insert your question and submit it using the control panel. There's a section there called questions. So feel free to put that in there, and we will do our best to get through as many of these as we possibly can. So Alan, the first question is a combination of 2 questions that folks had. There was a specific question about how long the effect is of root stoppage or root growth stoppage when that forage is grazed down too tightly. Is this something that happens very quickly and is very evident, or does it take time? And how long does it take for that root growth stoppage to fully recover? And within that, there was a question about how does this work for both range forage as well as introduced forage root systems?
Okay, so very, very good question, and obviously that's a very in-depth question. So Pete, help me if I'm not answering all of the different questions wrapped in that. Help me to remember them, and I'll continue with my answer. So the first is a 2-word answer. It depends. Okay, you know, if you crop it down too tight and it's not too hot and it's not too dry. In other words, if we still have decent temperatures out there, ambient temperatures, and we're still getting plenty of soil moisture, then it'll recover a lot quicker. All right. Now, it's never good because you're still creating a series of negative compounding effects. It'll just simply recover from those faster. But make no mistake, you have still cost yourself within that grazing season, you have cost yourself a number of grazing days, and you have cost yourself, forage biomass production. Okay. So we have to take that into account. But like I said earlier, if it's grubbed down too tight and it turns off hot and dry, it may not recover for the entire rest of that year. And it may be late recovery, late the next spring before it fully recovers. So you have just cost the entire rest of the grazing season on that particular portion of pasture land that you were grazing, or rangeland, by the way, and you may have cost yourself going into the next season as well. Not the least of which is you have created an opportunity for undesirable plant species to reappear and to outcompete in that same space. So how quickly do the negative impacts happen? Well, we've actually measured that. And by the way, we've also measured them on hay fields. And it's pretty similar. Most people that cut hay, they cut it down pretty tight. They cut it to around 3 inches, 4 inches. And so they want to cut it down pretty tight. And what we have found is that the exact same thing happens. It's just it's the same as grazing it down too tight. And we see within 2 days a significant decline in soil microbial activity and microbial biomass in 2 days. And you can measure this yourself. You can take samples pre and post and send them in for analysis, and you will get the same results. You have a profound decline in soil microbial population and biomass within just 2 days. And it oftentimes takes, in the summertime, particularly when we get into July and August, pretty much anywhere in the country, it often takes a month or longer. And that's a month if we have good conditions in soil moisture. It takes a month or longer to recover. So it is pretty critical that you keep this protected. Now, rangeland, the honest truth is it's even more critical. On rangeland, we're talking about lower rainfall, more semi-arid and arid environments. And it is very critical in those environments that you leave enough biomass above the ground. We've done this over and over. We've done it in many different states in Mexico. We've done this in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Western Colorado, so on and so forth, in a lot of semi-arid and arid regions on quite a bit of rangeland. And what we find is that it is even more critical that we not take our plants down too tight and we continue to shade that soil. And by the way, what we have found in more arid conditions is that when we use adaptive grazing, that we get very profound positive impacts that can be even more rapid than we see in more temperate environments. So Pete, is there a segment that I failed to get to or answer in there?
No, Alan, I think you answered them all there, so good job. We'll move on to a couple other questions. We have quite a few that are rolling in. We'll do our best to get to as many of these as we can. One of the questions that came in was if an individual is looking at degraded pasture with low diversity and biomass, do you recommend overseeding with a forb grass and legume mix? And I'm going to add a second part to that one, Alan, to make it even more challenging for you. And within that, what is, if you have a monoculture equally, what's the easiest and simplest way to create some diversity without needing to do any major reseeding?
Okay. All right. So again, excellent questions. And, these are questions I get, I guess, almost every time I speak somewhere. So, and again, there's actually multiple answers here. So you have more than one way to achieve greater diversity and complexity. So one is just simply through higher stock density grazing. Everybody has a latent seed bank. Everybody. We have not found anywhere in North America, South America, Mesoamerica, anywhere that we have been, this includes Australia, Africa, you name it, that there isn't a latent seed bank. So everybody has some type of latent seed bank. And how do you know that? Well, you have weeds growing, okay? Forbs. And if there's forbs, there's also grasses and legumes there, folks. They're there. The reason you don't see the grasses and legumes a lot is because your livestock take them out as soon as they start growing and leave the forbs. And that's why you see the forbs, because you haven't trained them to eat the forbs. So, that's part of the high stock density grazing as well. So we've done this very successfully over and over. And Thursday night, I'll actually present some of that in our case studies, where you see where we've taken pieces of land and using just the livestock impact itself without reseeding or overseeding or anything like that, we've actually created significant diversity just simply through tapping that latent seed bank. Now, to do that, though, you've got to have significantly higher stock densities and then give that previously grazed area an extended rest period. I recommend a minimum of an 80-day rest period before you come back. So you're not going to do your whole farm or ranch like this in any one given year. You attack it in sections each year, okay, to achieve this. So that's one way to do it without having to spend any money and just use your livestock alone to do that. Higher stock densities, and what do I mean by that? 200,000 pounds or greater. The more you tap the latent seed bank, okay? The key to tapping the latent seed bank is building your soil aggregate layer. The more you can build soil aggregate, the greater response you're going to get from that latent seed bank. And how do you build aggregate? By stimulating greater microbial activity. All right, a second way. Yes, you can overseed, interseed, drill, whatever you want to do. Broadcast, trample it in under high stock densities with your cattle or other livestock, drill in, multiple ways to interseed. We have done this very successfully as well. And when we do that, again, we want to plant a pretty diverse mix. We've done this in interim periods to take former row crop ground back to perennial pasture land. So for a couple of years, we'll plant that former row crop ground into highly complex annual mixes, graze that to stimulate the latent seed bank there, get it going, and then allow it to transition into perennial pasture. A third way that we've been able to do this highly effectively is through the use of bale grazing. And not just bale grazing in the winter. And this Thursday, I'll be talking about bale grazing and how to use that as well, and show you numerous examples and pictures of that and data from bale grazing. But we can bale graze in the summertime very purposefully on areas that are either a strict monoculture and desperately need some diversity, or areas that have very low forage density and there's a lot of bare ground showing. We can purposefully bale graze them even in the summer to stimulate latent seed bank and encourage greater diversity and complexity in our plant species there. So those are three of the best ways to achieve this, and each one of them depends on how rapidly you need to get a response and which one may work best in your particular situation.
Great. Thanks, Alan. So we have just a couple minutes left. Unfortunately, we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So I just want to make a quick note that if we don't get to your question tonight on the webinar, I'll make sure that Alan gets a list of all the questions, and I can have him, we can talk about how to follow up and provide some of those answers after the webinar is over via email. So just to know that if we don't get to it, because we likely won't, just a heads up that we'll handle it that way. So we'll make sure everyone gets the information that they need. Maybe one last question, again, kind of a set question here, Alan, trying to combine a few. There's a question about how to get cattle to, or any livestock to eat more of the plants that you might want to discourage and less of the plants that you would like to encourage. And specifically, there was also a question about how do you get cattle to eat forbs?
Okay. It's about like training your kids to eat the things they don't want to eat. You know, I've got kids and grandkids, and I know from experience that there's many things that they turn their noses up at that they've never even tried. They just say, I don't like that. I don't like that. And they've never even put it in their mouths before to try it. Well, why do we think our livestock are any different? You know, what do our livestock eat? They eat what they were trained to eat by their dams, by their mothers. Okay. And so how do we change that? Well, we got to create a competitive environment, and low stock densities and continuous and set stock grazing, even slow rotations, won't do that. They're still allowed to be too highly selective, and they're only going to eat what they have been trained to eat by their mothers. Even if it's an older cow, she's been eating the same thing her whole life. So how do you change that behavior? You change it once again through significantly higher stock densities, because what you're doing is you're creating a competitive nature among those cattle, that when they see cattle close to their sides, in front of them, behind them, they figure whatever it is in front of me, I better bite it and eat it before my neighbors all around me get it. I've got to grab it and go. And that's precisely what we have found. So, and the biggest thing is that you actually find, I know in our own cattle and in many of our clients' cattle, we have found that once those cattle start eating many of these forbs, they actually develop an affinity for them, and they'll start purposefully seeking out those forbs. And that includes things like common ragweed and giant ragweed and ironweed and sumac and buckbrush. You know, we've seen them. We have a lot of cattle now that eat thistle, and they'll purposefully seek out thistle. They'll seek out pigweed, you know, amaranths. And the great thing is all of those are loaded in nutrition, absolutely power packed in minerals and protein and TDN. And so they're very good, plus the secondary and tertiary compounds we talked about. So once you get them eating those types of things, they actually develop an affinity for them. And even at lower densities, they'll continue to eat a lot of those forages. But you have to go through that training process first. And again, the only way to do that is through higher densities. And at times you may have to do this for, you know, multiple days or even a couple of weeks or so, you know, in a row, so that you fully train everybody and get them used to the fact that, by golly, I just better eat whatever's there because I can't wait any longer. You know, it's like sending a kid to bed without supper. They're definitely going to eat the next day. You know, well, your cattle are a lot like that as well.
Great. Thanks, Alan. So unfortunately, we are at time, and I want to stick to the original time set for this so that everyone can move on with their day. Just the reminder that there are additional webinars coming up. Most importantly, part 3 is coming up this Thursday evening from 7 to 8:30 Central Time, and you can register for that. If you haven't, it's at pastureproject.org/events. And again, that is going to be focused on a lot of the implementation of these principles and practices that Alan ran through today in this webinar. And if you missed part 1, it's also a good opportunity to review that and refresh yourself on some of the fundamentals that were covered there. This is some contact information, of course, pastureproject.org, where you can find more info on this webinar and other webinars and other resources and programs. You can contact me directly via email if you have any questions, or if there's anything that we can do to help support your education and any of your practices on your farm. Feel free to reach out. We are here to help. That is our goal, is to help you be as successful as you can. And also, Alan's email is there as well. So he is open to email questions for those that are on the webinar if there's any particular follow-up questions that you might have. And with that, we'll say goodnight. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to having you on a webinar in the future.